What's up guys, Lon here from Android Authority, and the LG G5 is the successor to last year's G4, but it's really nothing like it. For the most part, the G5 is a completely different phone altogether, and a lot of that has to do with the design. Now, there's been a lot of controversy or confusion about the design of the G5. A lot of people are really curious if the phone is even really made of metal, or is it made of plastic, or a combination of the two. The truth is, the phone is made of metal. It's a die-cast unibody design, but it's undergone LG's secret treatment process that they call microdizing, which essentially puts a layer of primer and paint on the body of the phone, sort of the same way a car or a plane gets painted. That is basically what has happened here with the G5. So when you hold the phone, you're not actually touching bare metal. You're not going to get that same cold feel when picking it up in the morning like you would with a lot of other metal phones, but the coating also makes the phone a lot less slippery in the hand. The main benefit of the microdizing process is that it allows LG to make the phone appear a lot more seamless. So instead of having large plastic antenna lines running across the backside, LG has been able to hide all of that, and the only places where you actually see plastic is along the chamfered edges, which is a lot more inconspicuous than having large plastic antenna lines running across the back, which can typically break up the continuity of a smartphone's design. LG definitely had some good intentions with this microdizing process, but if there was one drawback to it, I would say it's the way it makes the phone feel. Because you aren't directly touching the metal or aluminum, it doesn't feel like a metal phone, so you don't really get to fully enjoy the fact that it is made of metal. It's kind of like having a metal phone inside of a protective case, and it's just something you have to wrap your head around when holding the G5. The overall build quality is still pretty top-notch though. It's got a nice weight to it, it's comfortable to hold, and it's smaller than last year's G4 due to a smaller display, which makes it a little easier to use in one hand. The power button is still located on the backside in typical LG fashion, but you'll notice the volume rockers have been moved back to a more traditional location on the left side, which I personally like better because you can adjust the volume of the phone without having to pick it up off a desk anymore. I just wish they weren't quite so flush with the body of the phone because it makes them a little harder to press and find by feel. The power button also doesn't have the most satisfying click. It feels very uneven and mushy, and it's honestly one of the least premium feeling parts about this phone. It does, however, double as a fingerprint scanner, and the fingerprint scanner feels very Nexus-like. It only takes 5 to 6 taps to register a fingerprint, and unlike other phones that use a power button or a home button as the fingerprint scanner, you don't actually have to press the power button in order for it to read your fingerprint. It'll unlock as soon as you rest your finger on it, and it does it pretty quickly and accurately too. On the bottom of the phone is a USB Type-C port, so that's nice to see, especially for a mainstream flagship, and flanking that is a microphone and a single bottom-firing speaker. Speaker quality is actually pretty good. It doesn't compare to front-facing speakers or anything, but it's loud and produces a clean sound even at max volume, and is one of the better single speakers I've heard on a smartphone in a long while. The G5 isn't going to win any awards for the way that it looks, but the G5 isn't about being the best-looking phone. It's about what this phone can actually do that makes it unique. Even though it's a unibody design, you still have expandable storage built into the SIM tray for up to an additional 200 gigabytes, and the bottom chin pops off with a simple press of a button, allowing you to remove and swap batteries on the fly. This removable bottom chin also makes the G5 one of the first modular smartphones to hit the mainstream, and it's really the most compelling part about this phone. With the G5, LG is introducing what they like to call friends, because not all of these components are actually modules. Some connect directly to the bottom of the phone, and some connect via Bluetooth, and there's only a handful of these friends right now, but there should be more coming in the future. Right now, the only module components are the camera grip, which gives you physical controls for launching the camera, taking a photo, and zooming in and out. It also gives you an extra 1200 milliamp hours worth of battery life on top of the standard G5 battery. The only downside to this camera grip is that it adds bulk and makes the G5 uncomfortable to use as a phone. The other module is a hi-fi audio DAC that LG teamed up with B&O to produce for higher quality audio when using headphones. This doesn't add bulk to the G5 in terms of width, but it does make the G5 a slightly taller phone. Other friends for the G5 include a VR headset and a 360-degree camera that lets you take 16 megapixel 360-degree photos or 360-degree video in 2K resolution. The display, as I mentioned earlier, is a little smaller this year at 5.3 inches, but it's large enough that things like YouTube, movies, and playing games is still a very enjoyable experience. It's an IPS LCD with the same resolution of 2560 by 1440 like last year's G4. It is slightly sharper due to the higher pixel density from the smaller screen, but otherwise it's a pretty typical display that you would expect from LG. It's super bright and easily visible outdoors, the viewing angles are really nice, and the color reproduction looks pretty spot on. They're vibrant without being overly saturated, saturated, and the whites on this display are a very pure shade of white, which is something I noticed about it almost immediately. The G5 also carries an always-on display similar to the V10, but instead of a separate tiny display, it's been incorporated into the main screen. It doesn't have a ton of functionality, but it can show you the clock, incoming notifications, or a signature or random message. The problem with it is it's not very bright, so if you're outdoors, it's practically invisible. This is probably due to the fact that it's an LCD, and LG had to keep the brightness low to help conserve battery life. With this being one of LG's biggest flagships of the year, you can of course expect to get the latest and greatest specs. So inside it's got the Snapdragon 820, Adreno 530, and 4 GB of RAM, and performance has been really snappy and fast. The animations are buttery smooth, it loads apps quickly, multitasks, and plays high-end games extremely well. I haven't noticed this phone slowing down whatsoever, and it's probably one of the smoothest performing phones that LG has ever put out. When playing games for extended periods of time or other heavy tasks, it does eventually get warm to the touch, especially with that metal body, but it was nothing out of the ordinary or anything to get alarmed about, and as far as regular everyday use, it keeps its cool just fine. As far as battery life goes, it's got a 2800 mAh battery inside, which is a decent size, although with flagships I typically like to see at least 3000 mAh or larger, but it's been enough to get the job done. I'm not getting the greatest screen on time numbers, with screen on time ranging anywhere between 3 to 4 hours, but with normal usage I can comfortably make it through a full day without hunting for a charger midway through the day. It does have Qualcomm's Quick Charge 3.0, which makes it really easy to fill up or top off, but even better than that is the fact that the battery can still be swapped out for a fresh one if you really want to take your phone from empty to full as quickly as possible. Even with this revamped design and change in build quality, it's pretty awesome that LG still managed to figure out a way to keep the core features of their smartphone intact. So last year LG did a dual camera setup with the V10 on the front-facing cameras, but this year LG decided to bring that dual setup to the rear of the G5. The main lens is a 16 megapixel sensor with optical image stabilization and an aperture of f1.8, and the second camera is a wide-angle 8 megapixel sensor at f2.4. The wide-angle camera is easily by far my favorite thing about the G5. It's totally awesome and a lot of fun, and even though it's lower resolution than the main sensor, I actually found myself using it more because I just love how the photos turn out, and you can really see how much of a difference it makes over the standard angle of the main camera. You can easily switch between the two cameras within the software by either tapping the two icons on the top of the camera interface, or it'll automatically switch cameras for you when zooming in and out. The camera software is still pretty much the same as it was on the G4 or the V10. You can keep it as simple as you want with the simple or auto modes, or if you want full DSLR-like controls over the settings such as white balance, ISO, and shutter speed, you can still do that with the manual mode. Picture quality has pretty much been exactly what I expected from a company like LG. The photos from the G5 are some of the sharpest and most well-detailed photos you can get from a smartphone. The color reproduction is very pleasing to the eye, and with that f1.8 aperture, you can get some really clean-looking depth of field, especially with close-ups or macro shots. There doesn't seem to be a ton of crazy over-sharpening going on, but I do notice that the camera has a tendency to really crush shadows in a lot of daytime shots, but the HDR mode does a solid job of compensating for that. It also doesn't oversaturate the colors, so pictures still come out looking pretty natural. Low light performance is decent, but it's definitely not the best that I've seen. It can overexpose a lot with the highlights, and there's a very noticeable amount of noise reduction going on, especially in nighttime shots. Also, because the G5 doesn't have that laser autofocus anymore, it doesn't focus quite as quickly in low light. As far as the front-facing camera goes, it's an 8 megapixel sensor with f2.0 aperture, and it takes pretty good selfies whether it be during the day or at night if you're into that sort of thing. Now the software is actually pretty interesting. It's running on Android 6.0 Marshmallow with LG's usual skin, but it's changed quite a bit for the G5, and it's probably the cleanest and least intrusive that LG's UI has ever been. It's got a much nicer looking color scheme with the white and light green colored accents in the notification shade and settings menu. By default, the settings menu is still a 4-panel setup that I've always found difficult to navigate, but LG gives you the option this time around to switch to a more traditional list view that falls in line more with what you normally get on stock Android. Many of LG's features like Smart Bulletin and Q-Slide apps are all still baked in, but they're not quite as in your face as before, and Smart Bulletin is actually off by default, but they are there if you dig deep enough into the settings to look for them. One feature that LG got rid of is the dual window feature, which was kind of a strange decision since a lot of people really like that feature, but considering that Android N will be bringing this feature natively, it may not be that big of a deal. The biggest change to LG software is the lack of an app drawer with a new launcher, which makes it feel more iOS-like, and if you've never used an Android phone without an app drawer before, you might find it to be a little bit jarring at first. Obviously, if you don't like this change, you can easily swap it out with a third-party launcher like the Google Now launcher, or if you want to stick purely to LG software, LG recently released their Home 4.0 launcher that's available for download in the Smart World application to bring back the app drawer. Pricing for the LG G5 is pretty typical for a flagship smartphone. It ranges anywhere between $600 to $700 off contract depending on carrier, with options to finance the cost through each respective carrier. The G5 is a step in a completely new direction for LG. It offers a brand new metal design, a very impressive dual camera setup, and its modular capabilities makes it one of the most unique smartphones we've seen in a long time. While other manufacturers are focused purely on making a good smartphone, LG wanted to create a product that stood out, and they've certainly been able to do that without sacrificing features like expandable storage and a removable battery. So even though this is a very different phone from what we've seen from LG in the past, they've still managed to stay true to themselves, but the most intriguing part about the G5 isn't what it's capable of doing now, but rather what it's capable of doing in the future, and that alone makes the G5 one very compelling smartphone. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this review of the LG G5. If you did, please give it a thumbs up down below, and also subscribe to the channel, which is also down below if you haven't already, and check us out on social media like Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, all that good stuff, and check me out on Twitter as well. All of that is linked down below. And if you want to see more here from us at Android Authority, make sure to check out the website at androidauthority.com, because we are your source for all things Android.